Welcome to Carly Tackle's Kitchen Cabinets, Part 6, your drawer face. Now that we've finished building our drawers and installing our drawer slides, we can make the faces for all of our drawers. To start, we need to measure the openings in our kitchen cabinets for all of our drawer faces. Once you have the openings measured, the next thing is to determine how much of an overlay you want your drawer face to have. For this project, I want a 1/2 inch overlay on each of my sides, which means I want my drawer face to be a 1/2 inch taller than the opening, a 1/2 inch lower than the opening, 1/2 inch on each of my sides. And this helps you determine how big a face you need. So for example, my drawer is my opening is 5 inches tall. If I want a 1/2 inch overlay on the top and a 1/2 inch on the bottom, my drawer faces need to be 6 inches tall. And the sides are 23.5 inch opening, but I want them to have a 1/2 inch on each side as well, which brings my drawer face to 24.5 inches wide. The style I'm choosing for my drawer face is the shaker style. The shaker style is made up of 5 pieces. You have your 2 style pieces, your 2 rail pieces, and a panel piece. To help you keep track which one are rails and which ones are stiles, I think about it this way. Rails are for trains. They run flat. They don't go up into the sky like buildings. And stiles, they're stand-up. S for stand-up, S for stiles. And that helps me keep track. Now the thing about your rails is they have tenons that go into a groove that we make into your stiles. We need to account for these tenons when determining how long a rail should be. For example, your stiles are pretty easy. There's not much to them in terms of guessing. They are what your height should be for your drawer face. So if you want a 6 inch drawer face, your stiles are going to be 6 inches tall. Same down here. Your rails are a little bit more difficult than your stiles. We need to do some math. We said that we want our drawer face to be 24.5 inches wide. We need to account for the thickness of both the style pieces on our board. Now this one's up to you. For my project, I'm doing 2 inches. A lot of people will do 2 1/4, whatever you like. I found that 2 1/4 inch was a little too narrow on some of my smaller drawers. I didn't have enough panels showing and I didn't care for it. So I went with 2 inches on all of my outside pieces. We need to account for that. So we need to take our drawer and minus 2 inches from the one style, 2 inches from the other style. But we need to add back our tenons. Our tenons are going into a 3/4 inch groove in our stiles. So now we need to add that back. This is 1.5 inches, this is 4 inches. So we're taking our 24.5, we're minusing our 4 inches, which brings us to 20.5, and now we have to add back 1.5 inches, which brings us to 22 inches. So our rails need to be 22 inches long to give us a drawer face that is 24.5 inches wide. So that's how you figure out your math. Using my DEWALT table saw, I am cutting 2 inch strips out of maple for my stiles and rails. I'm measuring out the stiles and rails onto my 2 inch strips, and I will take it over to my Bosch miter saw and cut it to my dimensions. As you cut your rails and stiles, make sure you mark which ones are which on top of the board. You'll find this comes in handy later. I installed my Dado set. I have it 1/4 inch thick. I need to set my fence 1/4 inch from the Dado set. I'm using these setup blocks to help me set my distance from my fence, but also the height of my blade. We are setting it to 3/4 inches high. you're going to run all of your stiles and rail pieces through your table saw. Make sure you keep the letters facing outward. It's just a great way to make sure that all of your pieces are cut the same. It's very hard to cut it exactly dead center. This way, if you're off slightly on one side, it's equal on everything. Once you have the grooves cut into all of your rails and stile pieces, it's time to set up your saw to cut the tenons on your rails. You're going to want to use a sacrifice fence, and that's that little sheet of plywood that I have clamped to my major fence. The saw blade is going to cut into that, and you would hate to do that to your real fence. I'm also adjusting my dado set. I had it set up for 1/4 inch thick, but now I needed to cut out 3/4 inches into these tenons. So now I'm adding more chippers to make my dado set 3/4 inch thick. When you're changing the blades on your saw, always unplug it first to be safe. Now I had already done this before I started shooting. I'm using my setup blocks again to help me calibrate my depth and set my fence correctly. Once I have that locked in, I will now work on calibrating the blade's height. For cutting the tenons, I'm going to be using a crosscut sled. The best way to determine your height is to place one of your rails on your crosscut sled and calibrate the blade up to just remove that bottom portion. I calibrated the blade with the R up on that rail. So every rail piece that I run through this first pass, I want to make sure the R is facing up. If your rails have two different thicknesses, you want to cut all of your rail pieces with the letters up and then recalibrate your blade and cut with the letter down. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm making sure that when I flip this piece, my R stays up and I'm cutting from the same end I just cut from. Before you switch to the other end, check your first cut. Did the saw blade take out enough or too much? Make sure you raise or lower that blade before making your second cut. Once your saw blade is set, you can cut all of your rail pieces on the one side. Your stiles do not need this, so do not cut them. Now that all of your rails have been cut on the one side, now we're going to cut the other side. Double check your blade's height before making this cut, readjust if necessary, and then follow the same procedure. Place it in a crosscut sled and slide it off. And now you should see your tenon form. Before cutting your second tenon, you may want to take this one and try it in one of your stiles, just to see how the fit is. If it's way too chubby yet to fit in the groove, you may want to adjust your saw blade before you cut the rest. If it's just really snug and you can't quite fit it in there, don't adjust your blade. We can use sandpaper and sand it slightly to make it fit. Your rails should all look like this and be ready to be inserted into your stiles on the side. Now we're not quite ready to assemble them and glue them. We still need to make our paneling that'll slide into our groove. For my paneling, I'm using a 1/2 inch thick maple plywood. You might be freaking out, didn't you just cut a 1/4 inch groove, not a 1/2 inch groove? And you're absolutely right. I learned this trick from watching Bourbon Moth Woodworking. He has this great trick for drawers so that the back of your paneling is flush with your face frame so you can have that solid surface. To pull this off, I need to set my blade to take out 3/4 inch of the paneling. So I'm using my gauge blocks to set that up with my sacrifice fence, and you'll also notice that I have my dado set back in my table saw. To set the height of the blade, I'm using one of my rails. I only want to take enough off the paneling so that it can fit inside the groove on all my stiles and rails. It should be about 1/4 inch high, but you definitely want to set it up for your rails. I would recommend being on the cautious side. It's better to have your blade too low and slowly adjust it than it is to have it too high and have your paneling being really, really loose. Do a quick fit test before cutting the other side. If you find you can't get it into your piece, raise your blade up. If you find that it's really loose, lower your blade. And when it's inserted correctly, your back should look like that. Your back of your panel is flush with the back of your face of your drawer, and the front is that inset shaker style. Once you're comfortable with where your blade is set, you can cut the other side. Eventually want to cut all 4 sides of the paneling like this. But before we do, I want to cut all of the long strips of all of the pieces first before cutting the ends. The main reason I recommend this approach is that cutting the ends, you should use a crosscut sled. That's what it's designed for, to help keep your piece stable. If you're going to use a crosscut sled, that means you have to recalibrate the height of your blade every time. So by cutting all of your length pieces first without the crosscut sled, you only have to touch that blade once. And then when you're ready to cut your ends, you can calibrate that blade height once and then cut all of them with your crosscut sled. It'll save you time and help keep all your pieces the same cut thickness. Like we did before with the sides, I recommend doing a dry fit test before cutting all of your other pieces. Now comes the fun part. So we're done cutting, now we get to assemble all of our pieces. I start by taking one of the panel pieces and inserting it into one of my rails, taking note which way the letter is facing so that I can match it with all of my other pieces. The rail tenons should line up with your panel. If you are struggling fitting one of your rail pieces into your stiles, take a little sandpaper and sand it down a little bit at a time. You don't want too big of gap that you have a hole to fill, but you don't want it too tight that when you put your glue on, it squeezes all out. You still want glue in your groove. I'm being careful not to get any glue on the hardwood paneling. I want that paneling to be able to expand, contract, and move around. I'm also cleaning up any glue that may have squeezed out with a wet cloth. And when I'm satisfied that end looks good, I flip it over and I place glue on the tenons on the other side of the rails. Careful with the glue that you don't get too much, that you have a lot of gush out, but enough that you can hold it in place. Before letting the glue dry, you want to make sure that your rails are perfectly flush with your stiles at the end. And you're done with the assembly stage. You need to let the drawer faces dry before sanding and staining. And if you want, you can add some clamps to help hold it into place. If you do have a few that have some gaps, don't panic. We can fill those with some wood filler. DAP makes my favorite wood filler. It seems to work the best. Just put a little in that groove, let it dry fully, and then sand it. And now you can barely tell that we had a gap there. When everything is dry, sand it down and then stain it or paint it. Thanks for watching Carly Tackles Kitchen Cabinets Part 6 Drawer Faces. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you'd like to see more videos similar to this and more in the kitchen cabinet series, please subscribe to my channel, Carly Tackles DIY, Tools and Gadgets, Tips and Tricks, and make sure you hit that bell to receive notifications when I release new content.